All right, good morning. Glad to see that everyone's still afraid of the front pews. It's good to see that nothing has changed. You know, I'm getting to the point now where I need to get my vision checked again, because now it used to be like you guys are all blurry to me, and that's okay as long as I can read what's on the screen. But it's getting to a point where the stuff on the screen is getting as blurry as your face, and that is not good. Getting old is not fun. A friend of mine actually asked me, he's like, what would you do if your wife ever left you because you're balding? And I said, well, it's hair loss. All right. I knew you guys like to start off with good jokes, and I found a good one. And that was it. I found a good one, and I did not share it this morning. No. This morning we're going to continue our series as we're going through Overlooked. And we've been talking about David and Saul and this rocky relationship that they've had in the Old Testament. And I threw some concepts at you last week that were difficult. And I know that they were difficult because as blurry as your faces are, I could still make out some skirmishes on the face that made me think they're not quite trekking with what I'm saying. And that is okay. Anytime I ever say anything that you think, I have more questions about that, I'm not sure about that, where did he get that from? Please come and talk to me. I would love to talk to you. Chances are, I could be wrong too. So please come and talk to me if you ever have a question or something I'm going to say. This morning's lesson is going to be talking about living in the shadow of David. So at this point in the story, Saul has died. Jonathan has died. Many of the descendants of Saul and Jonathan are also dead, and there's been a new king in town, and his name is David. David kind of takes over, and he sets up shop in Hebron there in Judah. And you kind of get this sense as you read the stories that happen after David that it seems like everything that happens after David, as far as kings are concerned, are compared to David. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a person in your life that you just could never seem to live up to. You could never overcome the shadow that they've cast upon your life. Some of you, that might be a parent or a sibling, someone that you were just never quite good enough. You never quite achieved what they achieved. That's kind of what it must have felt like to be a king in the line of David, just always living in his shadow, because every time a king is compared to another king, it's always to David. And it'll say things like, they did what David did and it was good, but more often than not, it'll say they did not do what David did and it was bad. Let's look at some examples of when Solomon, his son, becomes king. It says in 1 Kings chapter 3, if you walk in my ways by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David your father walked, then I will lengthen your days. So there's Solomon, beginning of his reign, and God tells him, if you will do what your father David did, I will lengthen your reign. Right at the very front of his kingship, already being compared to David. Solomon builds the temple. He builds the temple. And again, 1 Kings chapter 9, it says, it happened that as Solomon finished building the house of Yahweh, the king's house, and all the things Solomon desired to do, Yahweh appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. Yahweh said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me as David, your father walked, with integrity of heart and with uprightness to do according to all that I've commanded you, and if you keep my ordinances and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, a man will not be cut off for you from upon the throne of Israel. So after Solomon has built the temple that David wanted to build, again God speaks to Solomon and says, now if you will just act like your father. I don't know how many of you act like your father. Sometimes you're proud of it, and sometimes you get a little squirrely look on your face because you're like, I felt like I was just like my dad there. And sometimes you're like, that's a good feeling because my dad is a great person. And sometimes you're like, oh no, I just told a really bad joke, just like my dad would do. Hey, it's hair loss, you know? God tells Solomon, act like your dad. And there will never, ever not be a son of yours on the throne. Just act like your father. But Solomon also builds a temple to Molech and Chemosh. He likes to build things. He should have stopped at the temple to Yahweh. Now, if you don't know who Molech and Chemosh are, they were basically Ammonite and Moabite gods, and they were the gods that loved child sacrifice. It was their favorite thing. There's actually a story in 1 Kings chapter 3 where the king of Moab is being chased around and the Israelites are chasing him, and he finally offers up his son as a sacrifice on the wall. And it says a terrifying thunder, a terrible thing happened from the heavens upon the people, and everyone fled. Chemosh and Molech, they loved human sacrifice. And Solomon, the wisest person to have ever lived, certainly the wisest person to ever ruled in all of Israel, he built them. 1 Kings chapter 11, it doesn't take long. Chapter 9, he builds a temple unto Yahweh, and God says, this is wonderful, I love it, I put my name there forever. 2 chapters later, I'm going to build temples to Molech. Anyway, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Here we go again, you women, ruining everything. I'm just kidding. Next Sunday, only men are here. King Solomon loved many foreign women, the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite, from the nations which Yahweh had said to the Israelites, you shall not marry them, and they shall not marry you. They will certainly turn your heart after other gods. And so they had this rule in Israel where you just didn't marry foreign wives. Because, as much as I want to joke and say because you women ruined everything, men are not smart sometimes, especially in the presence of beautiful women. We get dumb sometimes, and we start doing things that we know we shouldn't do, perhaps. So it's actually the men's fault, not the women's. God says, don't marry these women, not because they're awful women, but because you don't have the willpower to stay true. You don't have the willpower to stay true. And these women, they worship other gods. And you're going to want to make them happy. And you're going to start worshiping those other gods too. And when you're a king like Solomon, you can do more than just worship them. You can build entire houses for them. Because you have the wherewithal to do it. But Solomon clung to them to love. He had 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart. If that does not sound like the not wisest guy you've ever met, I don't know what to tell you. You get out more than I do. Solomon went after Astoreth, this is Asherah, the god of the Sidonians, and after Molech, the abhorrence of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of Yahweh and did not fully follow Yahweh as David, his father, had done. There it is again. Solomon, you just can't escape the shadow of your father. If you could just live like your father, none of this would be happening. At that time, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the mountain which faces Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. Thus he did for all his foreign wives. So in other words, not just these two. Every foreign wife he had who had a different god, he built a little house for that god. Solomon. I was just talking to someone about this right before church. And I said, sometimes we don't notice the things that Scripture says because we have an idealized picture of how it's supposed to look, and so we don't see what Scripture is actually telling us. Solomon built 1,000 houses for different gods. Now, maybe some of those women from the same place, and so maybe you can cut that in half. Fine, we'll cut it in half. 500 houses to foreign gods on high places and hills surrounding Jerusalem. That's what Solomon did. It's weird because the only thing we seem to remember is that he built the temple for Yahweh. But that guy built a lot of temples. And not to Yahweh. We forget these things. We were, as I was talking to Nancy, I said, we forget. We think of Solomon as this man of peace, but we forget. And we read parts where Solomon kills people. He slaughters them as they're holding onto the horns of the altar. And he cuts them down. Solomon did that, right? Sometimes we bring with us these pictures and we actually don't see what the text tells us because we're so influenced by what we already know, right? So Solomon, and for those of you who remember here, you know I'm not a big fan of David, which you'll gather through the next few sermons. I'm also not a big fan of Solomon. Not a big fan of Solomon. It says, thus he did for all his foreign wives, offering incense and sacrificing to their gods. So Yahweh said to Solomon, because this was with you, and you did not keep my covenant and my ordinances, which I have commanded you, I will certainly tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. Now, if you're paying attention to the scriptural story, this is the third time in 3 Kings that God has done this. He did it to Saul. He tore the kingdom away from Saul. He gives it to David. David has a child, Solomon. He tears it away from Solomon. This is not a very good track record for kings in the land of Israel. So because you have done this, because you are not faithful to me, because you're going after all of these other gods, this kingdom can't be yours. This is Yahweh's land. This is Yahweh's territory. That's Yahweh's temple. You don't need these other temples. So I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you and give it to another. However, I will not do it in your days. Why not? For the sake of David, your father. There it is again. There it is again. Have you ever noticed that as you're reading Scripture? How many times Solomon is told, be like your dad? It happens again. And every time he does anything, God says, you weren't like your father. For the sake of your father David, from the hand of your son, I will tear it away. So he's like, I'll let you finish your rule and your reign, but when your children go to take the throne, it's going to be a mess. And if you keep reading, and we've already looked at this story, but when you keep reading, you find out it was quite a mess. It really did turn out to be quite a mess. Actually, nearly all the future kings, in one way or another, are weighed against David. You want another story? Too bad, you're getting it anyway. 1 Kings chapter 15. In the 18th year of the reign of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijah became king of Judah, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 years. His mother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom, which is kind of like Absalom, but not Absalom. He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his forefather had been. So now it's skipped on to future kings who were also in the line of David, just always in the shadow of David. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son to succeed him and by making Jerusalem strong. So we start to get this idea that David starts to feel like this perfect king. Now, how many of you grew up in church? You're kind of familiar with the story of David, give or take. You already know he's not really a perfect king, right? There's like this one glaring story that jumps out at you every time you think about King David. It's so much so, in fact, you might think it's the only mistake of consequence that David ever made. It says, for David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. And that is the story you thought of. I didn't even have to say it. As soon as I said David made a mistake, I see heads going, And I already know your thought wasn't, man, what he did to Abner, that was uncalled for. You're probably thinking, who's Abner? Right? Or why did he keep Joab around after all those things Joab did? Yeah, that was a mistake. Like, I have heard the name Joab, but I have no idea what Joab did or what you're even talking about. If you keep coming to church, you will know in due time, my friends, in due time. Right now, we're going to do what I call the low-hanging fruit of David, because the story is so awful and so bad, your minds couldn't help but come to that conclusion of what I was going to talk about. That's how bad it is. It is the most obvious transgression of David. It's not the only transgression, but it is the most obvious, and honestly, it is one of the worst stories you will ever read. If King David were running for office today and you knew about this story, you would not vote for him. It's a bad story. I know you're familiar with it. We're going to go through it in detail. The story of Uriah the Hittite. Now, outside of the story we're going to read, Uriah the Hittite is mentioned only by name. There's no stories connected to him. He's one of David's mighty men, but some of his mighty men have these great stories where they tore a bear apart with their bare hands, or they killed a lion, or they killed a giant, or they did these. Uriah the Hittite has none of those stories, but he's just one of those 33 men that run around with David through the forest when Saul's trying to kill him, and he's one of those guys. He's there with David at every battle. And if you know the story, Uriah the Hittite ends up dead. Now, if the word Hittite strikes you as odd, that's because he is a foreigner. A Hittite is a Canaanite. A Hittite is a Philistine. So we got Uriah the Hittite. 2 Samuel chapter 11. Sorry for the long lead-in, but I wanted to get this picture of why it is we have this idealized picture of David. And partly it's because at every turn, David is held up as the ideal. And yet one of those ideals brings to light this story and says, except for this story, it's almost as if to say, go back and read that story. So that's what we're going to do. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab, there's that name Joab, with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So all the men, all the fighting men are out fighting, but David is not there fighting. And this is actually something that happens again and again in David's life, where he's going to go fight and his men say, don't go. And so he doesn't go. So he's there in Jerusalem. All the men of battle are out at battle, but he's not there. It says, it happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Whoever Uriah the Hittite is, he has enough clout within the reigns of David to live close enough that when David walks on his balcony, he can see their house. He lives in the good part of town, where all the other people that are well-to-do live. He's right there, and David looks out and he sees this woman bathing, and he says, who is this woman? My gut feeling is he already knows who she is. But we'll just follow the story. He doesn't know who she is. He sends a servant to find out who is this woman, because David, he wants her. And what David wants, David takes. This is not the only example of this in David's life, but this is the one 1 Kings 15 told us to look at. This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Bathsheba's father is Eliam. Eliam's father is Ahithophel. Do you remember that name? He is a counselor with David. He's one of David's counselors. And it says that David would treat his advice like as if it were the advice of God. That's why I say there's no way he doesn't know who this is. The house of his mighty warrior, Uriah. The granddaughter of one of his officials, and he doesn't know who she is, and she lives right there beside him. Seems suspicious, but okay. So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. I would call this rape. Some people want to call it adultery. I do not. When you read the story of the prophet Nathan coming to David and telling David who's to blame, he says it's David, never her. Bathsheba never repents. Bathsheba never writes a psalm to talk about how bad they felt after the incident. Bathsheba's never held accountable for anything because Bathsheba didn't do anything wrong. David did. So the king sins after this woman. She comes into his presence because she doesn't have a choice. He's king. And there he lays with her. Now, she was purifying herself after her period. This is one of those weird notes because sometimes we read this story, and at least kind of the way I grew up, people would say, well, why is she out there bathing on the rooftop anyway? Because that's where you took baths in the ancient world. You try to make it up like she's out there trying to seduce men. She's purifying herself. The law required it of her, and she is following the law of Moses as she is there. David is not, because thou shalt not covet. But there he is, coveting. It says, then she returned to her house, The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. Now, how long it took her to realize she was pregnant, I don't know. She couldn't go down to the CVS and get a pregnancy test and find out in 5 minutes. A passage of time had to have occurred for her to say, uh-oh. Normally, I would have to be purifying myself again in that bath, but that's not happening. Oh boy. Somebody needs to tell King David that I'm pregnant. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people were fared and how the war was going. So he pretended to be interested in what the war was happening in the war. He doesn't really care. He's just making small talk. Hey, how's the war? How are the men? How's it going out there? Anyway, I impregnated your wife. No, he doesn't say that. David asked about Joab and the people and all of the things happening in the war. It says, then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Uriah went out to the king's house, and there he followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. So obviously what David is trying to do is get Uriah to go and have sex with his wife so that she become pregnant. And he can say, whew, crisis averted. No one will ever know what I did. Now, as much as I dislike King David, I have to tell you that resonates. Because how many times have we done something and thought, oh man, I got to start pulling some strings and making some things happen so no one will know what I did. David's first plan is no problem. I'll bring him back from battle. He's going to want to go and be with his wife, obviously. But he doesn't. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, you have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house? You're ruining my plan, man. Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in open fields. Shall I then go to my house and eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing. In other words, Uriah says, look, everybody that I'm fighting with, they're all living in tents and they're sleeping out in fields, and the Ark of the Covenant's in a tent, and your men are in tents. Why am I going to go to my house and enjoy the finer things of life when all of my men are basically suffering? So he refuses to do it. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. Okay. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. So David's plan B is, okay, you're not going to do it while you're fully coherent. Let's make you incoherent. I'm going to have you drink, and I'm going to get you drunk, and then you're not going to be making very good decisions, which is typically true. And you're going to go, and you're going to forget all these inhibitions about thinking about your men and the ark, and you're going to forget about all that. And you're just going to go, and you're going to do what's natural, man. Go to your wife. But he did not go to his wife. I just want to pause for a moment, and do you see the kind of mental processes that have to be happening in King David's head? For idea after idea to come up. There is, how do I phrase this? There is a wickedness that exists within the human mind that even King David could not avoid. Uriah seems to be avoiding it pretty well. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. Just that alone. You have to kind of know what the letter says, but just that detail alone is wicked. Here, Uriah, take this letter that's going to send you to your death. Here, you deliver it to the guy that's going to hand you over to be killed. Now go. Brazen. Rob, why don't you like David? Well, I'm getting warmed up. It's evil. It's evil. If I did this, you would no longer let me work at your church. Rob, you're fired. What did I do? In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. Whew. This is straight out of Netflix. This is right out of one of those crime documentaries, I promise. The nerve to send a man you want to die with the letter that's going to condemn him to death because you raped his wife and got her pregnant. Sometimes we're so anxious. Sometimes we're so anxious to jump to Psalm chapter 51 or jump to the story of David or the story of David and Nathan that we don't just sit and read this story. This is awful. This is awful. As Joab kept watch over the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. So as you read what happened to Uriah, what you actually find out is Joab actually didn't listen to David. If you've pictured in your head that Uriah died because he went out and everyone withdrew and everyone and all the Philistines, whoever was, killed him, that's actually not the picture that happens. Joab gets this letter, but Joab does something a little different. He assigns Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. He does put him in the danger zone, but he is a valiant warrior. He's one of the 33. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. So he died in battle in a normal way. What David wanted to have happen to him actually didn't happen, except for the fact that he did, in fact, die. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw an upper milestone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too. Okay, that's a lot of reading there. Let me summarize that. What he says is, go look, tell King David what happened. Tell him that we got really close to the city and a bunch of men died. And if he gets really angry and says, why did you get so close? We have a story that tells us, don't get so close. They can kill you from there. Why did you do it? Once he gets angry, then say, FYI, Uriah the Hittite is also dead. And he will calm right down. You will appease the angry king. I wonder what happens. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead as well. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you. Can you imagine a king, after losing a bunch of men in a battle, saying, this is no big deal. Don't you worry your wee little head about it. Everything's fine. It's great. Don't worry about it. No biggie. My youngest daughter, we have a little piano at our house, and she was pushing the bench back in, and it fell over and landed on part of the piano, and it broke a little board on the piano. And she was so sad I wasn't there, and she was so sad. Dad's going to be so mad at me. Dad's going to be so mad. But I got home, I was like, oh, it's okay. Accidents happen. That was David. Uriah's dead? Don't worry about it. Everyone else that died is collateral damage. It's fine. It's totally fine. Do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. That is an odd response to finding out you just lost a bunch of men. Not so odd when one of them is the man that you wanted to lose. Does this give you any idea as to how David thinks? When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, She made lamentation for him. And why wouldn't she? By all accounts, he is a great person. Always thinking of others, always putting them first, always putting himself last. Of course she's lamenting him. He was a great man. And he died. And she'll never see him again. And if they have children together before this son of David, they'll never see their dad again. All because of David. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. I want to end here. One, because this is where my sermon slides in, but two, because we're out of time, and three, because I think there's a really important point that needs to be made, is sometimes we are blinded by power. We get into a position of authority and we are blinded by it. Sometimes it is the littlest, smallest authority that any person on earth has ever had. And we get blinded by it. Blinded by our ambition. Blinded by what we think we have a right to. David thought he had a right to Bathsheba because he is king. And he can do what he wants, when he wants, and how he wants, with whoever he wants. He can take any woman he wants. He can kill any husband he wants. If other men die in the process, so be it. It's fine. Not a big deal. Keep fighting. I'll stay here in Jerusalem. You go back. You keep fighting. Sometimes we are blinded by our own ambitions. We're just blinded by it. David was so blinded to it, he had no idea the prophet Nathan was talking about him in his parable. Do you remember the parable? Right? Nathan comes up and says, hey, David, let me tell you this really funny story about something that happened in your kingdom. There's a really rich guy has all these sheep, and there's this really poor guy who only has one sheep. And the rich guy had family over and friends over. He's going to throw a party. So he took the poor guy's sheep and he killed it and they ate it. And that poor guy's family treated that sheep like a child. They loved that sheep. And David said, I'm going to kill that guy. Right? He has no idea he's talking about himself. That's how blind he was. Sometimes we're so blinded by our own ambition that we don't see that we are the man. We don't see it. We don't see it. David didn't see it. And as I read this story, sometimes I'll sit back and wonder, why did they keep saying, just be like David? They certainly must have meant, except for this. Sorry for math, but David is supposed to be greater than Saul. Remember last week or the week before, Saul was an attempted murderer? David is a murderer. There are some other things that Saul did that he lost the kingdom for that we will look at that David also did, but did not lose the kingdom for. We'll look at those stories in the coming weeks. I'm calling them the lesser-known Davidic misdeeds. If you want to read some of these stories about Abner and Joab and what all went down, you're going to have to come back because there's a lot of stories to go through. And luckily, we have all the time in the world. We just keep coming back next week until we're through all the stories. But for right now, I just want you to think about this in your own life. Is there something that you want so bad that you've forgotten that there's some people around you that might get hurt on your path to getting there? Uriah was always thinking, how are my men going to feel about this? If my men know that I come back into battle and that I was eating good foods and getting drunk and making love to my wife and enjoying all the great things of life while they're out suffering, sleeping in a field with a rock as a pillow, He was always thinking about others. David, at least in this story, only thought about himself and what he wanted. And it's an easy trap to fall into. And usually, like David, it's not until the storm is over and we can look back and go, oh, wow, the wake of damage I left. The amount of people I hurt because I acted like David and not Uriah. It's immense. It's immense. Be like Uriah. Don't end up dead, but be like Uriah. Think of others. Don't be so blinded by what you think you have a right to and what you want and what you desire and what your ambition is that you forget there are other people in your life. Real people, flesh and blood, full of feelings, people who can be hurt and can be ruined because you did what you wanted to do without ever thinking about another person. Amen? Amen.